So thanks everybody for being here. Basically what I'm going to do, just as a quick preview, I have a keynote presentation that's going to get us all on the same page for what we're talking about, because even though this is a big, exciting, relatively new field, there's a whole lot of terminology and there are a whole lot of just sort of interesting things about machine language and artificial intelligence and all that. So I'll do that, take a few questions, and then I'm going to just show some of these concepts in action, how this affects you as a photographer, and how you can take these technologies and either make things easier for yourself or do things that you couldn't do before with your photos. And yeah, and so I will try to break for questions as we go, but of course, throw questions in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that if I can, but I'm demonstrating. But anyway, this is going to be pretty good, informative, and free form. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and bring up a little keynote deck. And let's make sure, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. Okay, so here's the thing. If you pay attention to photography, you've probably heard the term AI a lot lately, whether it's, in WWDC announcements, or lots and lots of companies have features now that have AI tacked on to the end. You have Luminar AI, and it has a whole bunch of features that are, enhance AI. And it's almost getting to the point where, is this a real thing or is this just marketing? Well, so a few years ago, when I started noticing that this was becoming more of a trend, I started following it and figuring out, what goes into this. And it's been fascinating. It's led me to, for example, I'm now writing a column for Popular Photography magazine called The Smarter Image. And that is just allowing me to, just write about all sorts of things. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about today, and just the things that are coming up. But the key is that AI and computational photography, it's changing photography right now in a fundamental way. I would say, these technologies are as big of a shift in photography as going from film to digital. And maybe this is going a little bit out on a limb, but maybe also going from, uh, black and white to color film. So what am I talking about? Let's get on the same page here and figure out uh, what we're talking about, because you've also probably heard the term, like, everybody's a photographer now, because everybody has smartphones like the iPhone that take amazing pictures. Well, a huge part of that, a huge reason for that, is because of the stuff we're going to be talking about. So before I jump into specific things, I want to highlight something. If I can get Keynote to follow me. There we go. Okay. So what are we talking about? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, blah, blah, blah. There's this thing out there called DALL-E 2, and it is a machine language model, an artificial intelligence that you tell it a few words, you give it a text description, and it generates an image, a photorealistic image. So in this example from their website, uh, you could say, I want a picture of an astronaut riding a horse in a photorealistic style. And this image was entirely created by a an AI model. And on the site, if you go to openai.com/DALL-E 2, you can click some of these other things and see teddy bears lounging in a tropical resort in space. Um, and so, like, this is one aspect of AI where you have these computer models that can build things that don't even exist photographically. And as they are opening up access to this on a sort of a um, slow person by person basis, um, I'm starting to see online a lot of people bringing up more things like, I want a banana space ranger, and it will just do that. Things like that. Okay, so this is sort of where this technology is headed as one example. But before I jump into photography, I have to point out one of my favorite examples of AI, and that is pastry AI. So what happened? This is a little bit of a sidebar here, but so in Japan, the way you go and go to a pastry shop and you basically like grab a whole bunch of individually wrapped pastries and then you go pay for them. And there are a huge variety. And so the problem was you would have, the person ringing up the amounts would have to like know what all of these things are. It would take a lot of time. And so somebody invented this pastry AI. And what it would do is it has a little camera that looks down, and you put all your pastries onto the tray under the camera, and the camera, the software knows what each thing is. And so in a few seconds, it can say, oh, you have, these 7 things and it's going to cost this much money. So, great, who cares? Well, what's interesting is when you think about an image of a bunch of pastry on a tray, well, that in some ways is kind of close to uh, the idea of a bunch of cells on a slide. And it turns out that with a little bit of tweaking, this AI model can identify cancerous cells with 99% accuracy. So this is like another example, not specifically photographic, although it is dealing with images. But what's important here is A, it's super cool. B, AI is affecting all sorts of different areas, not just photography. And C, it's an example of the software knowing more about what it's seeing. So that's going to come into play here. All right. I think already I've said artificial intelligence, machine learning, and computational photography. And those terms get thrown around a lot. So let's kind of nail down what these mean, because they actually have specific meanings, but they're used in really weird ways. So AI is artificial intelligence. And when you hear AI, you probably think of these types of things, these sci-fi movies. And it's a catch-all it's a catch-all term. And I'm pretty sure that real data scientists, real AI scientists probably bristle at the term, because artificial intelligence really means, a system that is sentient, that is completely thinking for itself. And that doesn't quite exist. However, AI is like a really great little shorthand. And so it's a lot easier to say, this feature uses AI, rather than saying this feature uses a computational photography machine language model, blah, blah, blah. And then everybody's gone to sleep and they're not going to buy your product. The good news is that even though we're sort of appropriating the term AI, especially in these like science fiction examples, AIs tend to go crazy and murder people. And so we're not dealing with that, which I'm very, very grateful for. Okay, so that's AI. Now there's machine learning, and this is a more accurate term for what we're talking about. So in machine learning, a computer model is fed a lot of data. In this case, a whole bunch of photos, like hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of photos. And all those photos are fed into a supercomputer that analyzes what's in the images. And then with the help of data scientists, they identify things like trees and people and skies. And as the computer model is fed more information, it quote unquote learns, in the sense that, okay, it already knows what a tree looks like. Well, then it can figure out, well, this is a pine tree versus an elm tree. And the models are sort of building on themselves so that they're learning more and more, and they can process a bunch of more data and sort of quasi understand what is in a photo. And this is really the key thing about a lot of what we're talking about today, because like, you're not having to tell your software what's what. You're not having to do a lot of, say, manual masking, because the software already knows what it's looking at. So here's an example. Oh, wait, no, I gotta circle back to computational photography. So computational photography is more of an umbrella term. And usually we're talking about like image capture. So for example, when you tap the shutter button on your iPhone, it doesn't just record what happened to be in front of the camera and, just take those light values and record them to the sensor. What an iPhone is doing now is it's actually capturing like a dozen different images at different exposures, and it's examining each one of those, and it's picking out things that it recognizes, like backgrounds and foregrounds and people and faces. And, in some cases, it knows that you're looking at trees. It knows that you're at the ocean. And then taking all those images and smashing them together and merging them into one completed image. And so even though it just took, a millisecond for you to tap and get an image, every time you do this, it's the iPhone is doing all of this processing. And this is why Apple has invested so much money and has something like, last I heard, 600 engineers or maybe even more just working on the iPhone camera technologies, because the idea is you're just going to tap the shutter button and you're going to get a great picture. And sometimes that's not possible using sort of just a straight ahead capturing the light that's in front of the camera. Okay, so that is AI, machine learning, and computational photography. And I will say right at the top that I will probably screw up, and I'll say AI when I mean ML, when I mean computational photography, but you'll get the idea. Okay, so let's look a little bit closer into how machine learning works. All right, this is what we see. Now, as soon as this image flashed up on your screens, your brain looked at it and you said, there's a woman in the foreground and she's standing in front of a field of sunflowers. And judging by the color in the sky, it's probably getting towards sunset because it's not super blue and it's a little bit orange over there on the side. And that's because, we are trained from the very beginning to recognize patterns. So this is what we see. Now, what the computer sees, like you open this up in Photoshop, and it doesn't see any of that. It says, okay, here's a blue pixel, here's a yellow pixel, here's an orange pixel, here's a green pixel. And basically all it is just pure data. So when we have software that can do some of the machine language stuff, well, now the software sees more like we do. So it looks and it says, there is a person-shaped thing that's occupying most of the image. So that is probably a person, and it's probably also the subject. And those green and yellow things in the background. Well, that matches what I know to be a sunflower or a field of sunflowers. And typically in a shot like this, in you know all of the hundreds of thousands of shots that I've seen, that top third area behind a subject that has this kind of characteristic is probably a sky. I see. Already, I'm getting into trouble because I'm anthropomorphizing the AI models and talking in the first person. But we'll forget about that for a second. So now that it knows what's in the image, it can do more with that data. So, for example, when it knows that there's a person, well, people tend to have very consistent features. People have eyes, they have noses, they have a mouth, they have a face. And so it can know where those things are and what those are in the image. And it can even go one step further and not just know that this is a person and this is a person that has the facial characteristics of a person, but it can know that these are the facial characteristics of this specific person that I've named. So that, for example, this is in the Lightroom app. I can say, I want to find all pictures of Kim Carlson. And it will just show me these. And I didn't have to tag them. I didn't have to add keywords. It just knows, oh, these are all Kim Carlson. And so I'm going to show you all these pictures. That can save a huge amount of time if you are, putting together a family photo album or, doing something for an event, or, you just want to see pictures of the people that you like. Okay. One little side note about how AI can understand things. This is something that you can do now. If you take a picture with your iPhone, and I want to say in the last, like maybe iOS 14, this was introduced, or maybe iOS 15. Anyway, here's a picture of a sunflower that I took. Actually, not a sunflower; it's a flower. Well, here, I'll explain that in just a second. If you notice, at the bottom of the screen, you have that little eye icon. And normally, it's just a little eye icon, and you tap it, and you get information about the image. But if there's something that the software might recognize, it has this little sparkle to it, to the icon. So you tap that. And what that indicates is that, the app, in this case, this is the Photos app on the phone, knows that, oh, this is some sort of a plant. This is some sort of a flower. And so then if you tap the look up button, so it says, oh, this is a plant, it will do a lookup online, and it will say, yes, this is probably a common sunflower. Now, I love this because even though I am a photographer, I'm terrible about identifying flowers and plants. I mean, it's really pathetic because I should be able to say, this is the deciduous blah, blah, blah. And I don't. Like, my brain doesn't retain that knowledge. And so here I can, take a nice picture, maybe with my other camera, take a little snapshot with my iPhone, and be able to then post this later and say, yes, well, I was in a field of genus Helianthus, and people think, wow, he's really smart, and he's really not. Let's not even pretend on that sense. All right, I'm almost done with the keynote section, but I want to touch on what your phone is doing. And this is, I mentioned that we have that computational photography where the phone is capturing a bunch of different slices. So one of the names that Apple gives that is Smart HDR. There's also a feature called Deep Fusion. And at one point, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 revisions ago, this was entirely optional. You could turn it off in settings. And then I think with the iPhone 8 or maybe the iPhone 10, Apple was so sure of how well it was working, they just made it automatic. And so that's what we have on our phones now. So let's take a look at this picture for a second. This is a shot that I took with my iPhone 13 Pro. This is unedited, straight out of the camera. And you can see a pretty good detail throughout. There's detail in the glass in the foreground. You can see clouds in the background. It's pretty well balanced, and it's close to what my eyes saw when I was there. Now, here's a version that has basically no smart HDR applied. So this it's close to what the sensor has captured. And this is the exact same image. I didn't take two separate images. And so what you see here is you still have detail in the foreground, but the clouds are almost entirely blown out. So what's happening is the iPhone is looking at this scene, and it recognizes that there are foreground objects. It recognizes where the sky is already, and it will take those multiple exposures, and knowing that the sky is going to be blown out to white, it captures a version of this that's underexposed and then automatically applies that just to the sky. Now, the way I got this to work is this is actually an Apple ProRAW image. So if you have an iPhone 12 Pro or iPhone 13 Pro, you can choose to shoot in ProRAW, and basically it will create this smart HDR version and then still have this raw image as the base. And if I wanted to, I could edit that raw version, say in Lightroom, and get something pretty close to what the camera captured straight ahead. But this was me going in and messing with sliders and making sure that I selected the sky separately and reduced the exposure. Like all these things that I had to do separately that took a few minutes later, the phone, for the most part, just captures when you take the picture. So that's pretty cool. And also, this is something that the average person is not going to go in and mess with the raw file or do very much editing. They're just going to take a picture and say, oh, this is where I was. I'm going to send this to my friend, or I'm going to be able to keep this in my photo library. And so that's pretty cool. All right, so basically, because the software can know more about an image, this is kind of the crux of what AI is doing for us right now. Because it can know more about the image, it can do more things. And that for you, that translates to saving time, like masking, for example. I'll show an example of this in a bit, but here we want to just select the subject. And in the past, you would go into Photoshop and you maybe paint a mask or create layers or do basically a lot of work, especially in this case where, she has hair that's not, it's sort of going in a bunch of different directions because it's a windy day, but it's also very close to the color of the background there. Well, in Lightroom, and I'll show this in a minute, you can ask Lightroom to select the subject, and this is what it creates in literally maybe 15 seconds. And including the hair, it's really pretty amazing. And all of that is due to these machine language models and AI technologies. Okay, so that is my keynote deck. Looks like we have a bunch of questions, perhaps.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay.
Not
All
yet.
right. I just saw that there's 17 people on the chat, so excellent. And grab a little coffee. Okay. So a few things that we can do. And I should probably point this out. If astute viewers would notice that I have a whole bunch of apps open. So we are tempting the demo gods by having I don't know, like 6 or 7 big time applications open. But this is an M1 MacBook Pro, so I think it's going to be able to handle it. So let's talk about a little bit what it can do for us on a very simple basis. So here I am in Lightroom, and I should also point out that a lot of what I'm going to show you can do in different apps. These are just sort of representative. Like for example, this is Lightroom, the sort of cloud focused version of Lightroom. These features also exist in Lightroom Classic. You can do it in Photoshop and the Photos app. Like a lot of these things will translate to a bunch of different apps, and a large part of that is because companies realize that this is a competitive advantage to be able to do things like that. Okay, so here's an image, another image from Washington, D.C., and straight out of the camera, this was shot with my Fuji XT or Fuji X100V. So this, is a perfectly fine shot, but you know, in my memory, that was a little bit more of a deep, more saturated sunset. Well, what I can do is I can click the auto button. Now, if you've been editing photos for a while, the auto settings, the auto button would often be the thing that was really kind of a hit or miss. Like you click it and you see, all right, what does it think? And sometimes it would give you something good, and sometimes it would be not good at all. Well, these auto features are now based on AI technologies because it's looked at hundreds of thousands of images of sunsets. And so it knows when I click auto that this is something that needs a little bit more saturation in the background and maybe, bringing up the shadows in the foreground. This is, I would say, a pretty good image that I would share with somebody just by clicking auto. Now, as another example, I'm going to go to Luminar AI. And Luminar takes a slightly different approach. When you open an image to edit it, it does its little scan to figure out what's in the image. And it has this slider, this tool called Enhance AI. And there's just this one slider called Accent AI. And so instead of clicking auto and just seeing what it gets, you can drag this slider and it's going to apply basically its own automatic corrections based on what it knows about in the image. So in this case, and I'm going to sort of push it all the way to the max just because it's a little easier to see, over a Zoom call. But what it's done is it has added more green to the foreground, to the daffodil stalks. It's done a whole lot to the sky. It's added more blue. It's brought out the contrast. I can turn this off so you can see, like, this is the before and this is the after. And in a whole lot of cases, like maybe all you need is this Accent AI slider, and then you have, a pretty good image. Now, if I wanted to, I could build on top of this. So for example, maybe I want to make the yellows a bit more brighter so that they're not so in shadow here in the middle. But again, I haven't had to do any sort of sky selection or masking or gradients or any of the things that even just a few years ago I would have to do to make this a more usable image. One last auto thing I want to show is in Photoshop. Here's an unedited image here. And so Photoshop has these thing called neural filters. And right now, a lot of this is kind of a playground for Adobe, but there are, actual practical uses for some of this. But what I want to show you is this thing called Landscape Mixer. And the idea behind this is it's going to use AI to give a completely different look to this image. So when I turn this on and I say, you know, maybe I want this to be a snow scene, and it processes for a second, and I can make that a little bit more visible. So here with one click, it's made this a snowy scene. Now, this is not a great rendition. And in fact, I have a feeling that a lot of the flowers in the background have been turned into snow-covered pine trees, maybe. But this gives you an idea of what's possible and where things are going, because it's entirely possible that, you know, in 2 years, if I were to come and do this exact same thing, it would know this is a field of tulips and be able to, you know, put snow on top of the tulips and change things in that way. So this is like another auto form. I don't think I would ever actually use this, but it's super interesting. Okay. I mentioned making selections. So let's see that in action. Now, this is a really common photographic thing that you'll run into. So in this instance, I really like this photo. However, it's a bit cool, and she is a bit underexposed. If I bring up the histogram over here, we can see that there's just a lot of dark values in the image. And so I don't necessarily want to bring up the exposure on the entire image because I want to focus on her. I don't really want to add more detail to the background or more exposure to the background because, you know, she's the subject. We want to spotlight her. So what I would have to do in the past is probably, you know, shift this off to Photoshop and use some of the masking tools to select her. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the masking tool, and I'm just going to say select subject. And actually, she looks terrible because it applied a preset from before. Let's turn that off. Because we do not want to make our subjects look ill. And you can see after, again, that was like 15 seconds or something, we now have a really good mask that has just selected her. So when I go and use these controls, I can increase the exposure on her. I can warm up the color temperature on her because she is not that pale usually. I had shot this at, I think the auto white balance had misread the scene. You know, and then, you know, maybe I could, you know, increase the saturation or, you know, basically almost all of the editing tools that you have normally, I can just apply to her. Now, what I just finished doing, which took 30 seconds, if I had to do this without being able to select the subject like that, it would have involved, you know, at least several minutes, maybe even longer, because I would have to maybe either paint the areas where she's in, or I might use like a radial mask to add more light to her face and then build on her torso and her shoulders. And then again, probably have to throw that into Photoshop to get the really fine detail around her hair. Let me just zoom in and we can see, you know, like we don't have any weird halos. We don't have a lot of the characteristics of bad masking. And this also means that you don't have to be an expert in how to make masks in Photoshop to take just, you know, a regular photo and make the person look a little bit better. Another thing that I want to show is in Luminar. Go back to the library. So I mentioned that we have an image and the software has already looked at the image and figured out what's in it. Now, in a lot of applications, you'll have a tool called Clarity. In Luminar, it's called Structure. And basically what it does is it enhances the local contrast so that, well, in a lot of cases, maybe you'll get a little bit more detail. Sometimes it can be really good with landscape photos. And so if I increase the structure here, like let's say I want to really make that background pop. That's like one of my favorite buildings in Seattle. The problem with clarity and structure is that they typically apply to the entire image. So you can get additional local contrast on those buildings, but you're also going to get a lot of additional contrast on your subject. And if you've ever done this, you know that adding clarity to people basically makes them look horrible. They look, 20 years older, bad dark shadows, etc. So in Luminar, I'm going to increase this structure AI tool. And I'm going to go again, like I'm going to overdo it just to make sure that that you can see the effect. So in the background, let me do a little split here. So if you look at the background, it's a little bit soft there. And then after, it's a little more hard edge. It's got more of a, a gritty look to it. However, you'll notice that the subject isn't changed. So the software knew, there's a person here. And I know that if there's a person, I need to not apply that structure to them because it makes people look terrible. And again, didn't have to make any masks, didn't have to do anything separate. It just knew that we're not going to make people look terrible from this structure. Another example of making selections. And it's kind of funny because for the longest time, Lightroom has been the tool that didn't really do selections. Lightroom was very much the almost Photoshop. It was for photographers who did not want to deal with Photoshop, didn't want to deal with layers and a lot of the super complex, powerful stuff that Photoshop can do. And so almost all of the adjustments that you would make in Lightroom would be ones that apply to the entire image. And gradually you could do like gradations and radial masks and things like that. But they were always really blunt instruments. And so part of the reason why I'm going on and on about masking is that there are just so many instances where you find yourself wanting to fix one specific area and you can't, or you have to just do a whole lot of extra work. Let's see. One more thing to show in terms of selections, or rather not making a selection. So in Luminar Neo, which is the newest version of Luminar, well, let's look at the problem here. The problem here, in terms of, the photographic problem. So this is a photo taken by my friend Carol Harold, and this is a very typical like wedding scene where she's put the subject in shade because as you can tell, it's a sunny day. And if the bride had been standing in the sun, it would have led to a lot of harsh values, maybe harsh shadows, really bright spots. And so what you do is, you put a person in the shade and you take a picture of them there. And it's a great picture, but I want her to show up a little bit more because obviously she's the bride. She is the star of the show. Again, it knows what, the software knows what's in the image. And there's a tool in Neo that's not in Luminar AI called Relight AI. And it has this brightness near and brightness far slider. And so I can increase the brightness near, and sometimes because this Neo, it needs to think a little bit. And so what it's done is it has just determined that the person is probably the subject and has illuminated her entire body. Now, there are tools that I'll show in a minute where you can like lighten someone's face, but that wouldn't work here because then she would just have like a brighter face and her body would look the same. If I wanted to, I could change like the darkness of the background, and there are ways to make the effect blend well, etc. But the point is, it knows that this is a subject, and this subject is probably in the foreground, and so we're just going to brighten that subject. And again, I didn't have to do anything except drag a slider, which is A, monumental if you've ever done this sort of editing before. B, especially great if you are doing something like a wedding where you're having to deal with a whole bunch of shots, or an event where you have a whole bunch of different shots of people. Okay, one last thing about making selections. And this is, I have to admit, I completely rolled my eyes when this feature came out. There are times when you will go on a photo shoot and you're going to get skunked by the weather. So in this case, this is at Mono Lake in California. And the only time I was able to be there was, smack dab at the top of the afternoon. So there's no interesting clouds. The sunlight is pretty harsh, but look at it. These formations, they're like deposit formations, are really super cool. And so I took this picture. Now, if I wanted to get creative, I could do that. Like, I want a better sky. And like I said, I rolled my eyes at this for a while because I was like, well, you can't mess with the original. Like, it's a documentation of where you were at that time. And yes, there's absolutely a place for that, but sometimes you just want to be creative. Sometimes you want to have a better picture that doesn't necessarily, violate the spirit of what it was you saw. So for example, using this Sky AI tool, I can click Sky Selection and I can say, I just want some clouds in the sky. And what it will do, again, because it knows what's in the image, it knows where the sky is. So it's going to add these clouds to the sky. And also, it's smart enough that it knows, that looks like a reflection. That looks like a body of water. And so it adds the reflection of the clouds in the sky. And I can go even a little bit further, and there are a whole bunch of tools in terms of fine-tuning this. But I can change the relighting of the scene based on the color of the sky and the appearance of the sky. It doesn't really show it too much here, but like, let's say I do something like this. Now, I would look at this and say, something seems a little off because the lighting in the foreground here is not quite right. So this is going a little bit too far in terms of trying to make a believable image to show that I was there at sunset. So that goes a little bit too far, but I can just go back and say, you know what? I would be perfectly happy to share this and to show that scene of these rocks, because nobody's going to look at this and go, those look like artificial clouds, because they're not. But again, the point is, I didn't have to do any selections. I didn't have to, if you've ever tried to replace the sky, and this is also, from a practical perspective, this is something that, for example, real estate photographers will use a lot, because sometimes a real estate photographer will go and shoot a house and they'll have maybe an hour to do it. And the sky is what you get when you're there, and that's all you get. But of course, you want to make something that looks appealing to a seller, and therefore they'll come in and they'll use some sky replacement so that, you know what, that house was really, looked fine on a bland day, but let's add a little bit of drama to the sky so that the people looking at it get a better, sort of more favorable idea of what the house looks like. So even though, there's still that like tiny photographic purist in me that's like, no, that's not how it was shot. Um, I I've quickly gotten over that. So okay, before I move on to portrait retouching, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Melissa Green, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Jeff, it looks like stock photo clouds there. Can Luminar AI use my cloud photos?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So yeah, these the ones I showed you were ones that come with the app. But like, let's see if we go down here. This is one that I shot, and you can already see part of the problem is that it's I shot this, and like it has. I didn't shoot this as a sky to be used. I just shot this because it was a cool sky. And so what I can do is I can change the position of this, and there are refinement tools to make it blend a little bit better into the background. But yeah, you can absolutely use your own images there.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Okay. Chris Frank, did you get your question answered? Sort of, maybe? Yes, no?
No.
Can you? All right, unmute yourself. Ask a question, please.
Yeah, I mean, I use the Smart HDR a lot on my iPhone, but it's brilliant for the HDR, but it tends to over sharpen all the images. And I tried on several editors to unsharpen several different ones, but it just doesn't work. And the images don't look quite realistic. They just look a little bit too AI.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there a solution for that?
So there are a couple of things you can do. So this is actually something that has come up. Actually, I will point you to my site, jeffcarlson.com. I wrote a column about this and basically like how to deal with an overzealous AI. And there are a few things you can do depending on what phone model you have. There's 11. Okay. In the 13, there's a feature called photographic styles, which lets you dial back some of that. But I think the better answer to that is if you want to have that editing ability, you need to shoot in RAW, and then you have more latitude for controlling all those little bits. Now, the problem is if you're shooting in RAW, you're not taking advantage of the HDR. And on an 11, let's see. Yeah, the 11 doesn't offer ProRAW because
no, it doesn't. But there are some third-party apps that do offer RAW.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And in fact, like as an example, I'm sorry, what?
It's a little more fiddly to get HDR than, I mean, that's the beauty of the iPhone. The the Apple HDR is very
yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Well, okay, I would check out the app Halide or Halide. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, because they take advantage of a lot of AI stuff, both Apple's and their own. That might give you a good mix there, and I hate to sound like an Apple shill, but going from an 11 to a 13 or a 14 in the fall, whenever that comes out, there's enough of a jump that I think if you were already thinking about maybe it's time to change your phone, that you would see an improvement there. I found that having the ProRAW is really handy, partially because, actually, let me show you this real quick. If I look at, I think this picture. Okay. So the way ProRAW works, I touched on it briefly, but basically Apple is smashing together its smart HDR with RAW, and it does it in kind of an interesting way that would be too lengthy to go into now. But basically, like in Lightroom, and there's another app also called Raw Power that's really good on the Mac. So if I look at this just with the default Adobe Color, this is what it sees, because it's not recognizing any of the Pro RAW features, that HDR look. And so what Adobe does is they have just a profile called Apple Pro RAW, and there's an amount slider. So if that's, a little bit too, too much in one way or the other, you can, decrease the amount of the pro rawness of it, or increase it. And that gives you a little bit of flexibility there. But again, that doesn't apply to the 11, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Billy McKee, did you get your question answered?
Thanks, Cheetah. Not quite. In the essence,
You're breaking, Billy,
Yeah.
you're breaking up. Can you repeat your question, please?
Sorry. For the vast majority of people, learning the features of these automated softwares is probably more sense than RAW, because RAW is a very niche product for when these technologies don't work. And you just wonder, are people better served by actually learning how to use all these presets rather than having to reinvent the wheel from the foundations up with RAW? I mean, there are times when you need it. I'm not saying that there aren't, but for the vast majority of stuff, you could probably get most of the software to do the heavy lifting without really wasting a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of time. It's only a thought. Just wondered, what are your thoughts on this, on the way the industry's going? I mean, if there's 600 engineers in this, they're going to sort a lot more out than you are.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think
is it potentially a dead end that purists are actually dragging this industry towards, and in fact it will just disappear with the dodo as the technologies improve, I suppose, is the other thought. But
well, kind of yes and no, and actually this is a sort of an ongoing friction, and actually one of the reasons I like writing my column is because there's that idea that all right, so if my phone knows so much about my image, or what it's looking at, and it can change everything, and it can make a perfect shot, like where do I fit in as a photographer? And there are a bunch of different answers to that. One, you're still there composing the image, figuring out what is interesting. You're looking for moments and scenes, and there's all of that. And I think a lot of photographers forget about that because it's so ingrained that, oh, I am the photographer, and of course I know what I'm going to be shooting, and it's my perspective that I'm bringing to this. But then they see software that is doing all this stuff that would have taken them hours before, and they're like, well, all right, so that kind of makes a lot of my skill irrelevant. Another part of this, I think, is and I just have to say, I got an email from a photographer after one of my columns, and he was just irate. And I think he actually said, he's like, well, I'm just going to go and throw away my 40 years of photography because I'm not my skills aren't valued, et cetera, et cetera. And my response was, if that makes you happy, I guess. I didn't actually respond to him, but what a lot of these technologies are doing for normal people, normal people, for non-photographers, is allowing them to get really good shots with these small devices. And a huge reason for these technologies on iPhone in particular is because the camera hardware is very, very small. You have tiny sensors, you have tiny lenses. There isn't even an aperture that you can change. There's just a fixed aperture. And so people can take their phone and get a really good shot. I mean, I have examples. I went to the bristlecone pine forest in California. These 1,000-year-old trees, and was shooting late at night, doing long exposures with my Fuji camera on a tripod, and I would set up a 30-second exposure, hit the shot, and while the camera was capturing that image, and this is really late at night, I pull out my iPhone and take a quick snap, and I can tell the difference between the two, but some of the shots from the iPhone are really darn good. And I wouldn't have had to have any other knowledge of processing or making long exposures or using tripods or anything like that. So that's a very long way of saying, yes, these technologies are changing things, but what I think a lot of it is focused on is not to replace what we're doing, but to make some of the drudgerous, some of the boring repetitive tasks easier. And so there's always going to be a place for shooting in RAW, and part of the reason why I like Apple ProRAW is that you have that RAW option, and just by itself there's a lot more image data in the photo, so that if you want to take it into an editing app, you can do that and do more with it. But if you don't, it's fine as it is.
All right, all yours, Jeff.
All right. Thank you.
Chat is disabled at the moment.
Okay,
Chat is disabled.
Okay. All right, then go ahead, Jeff. Eckert just heard that, I believe. So we will continue on with Jeff, and hopefully that can be fixed.
Okay.
All right, Jeff, all yours.
You betcha. Yeah, Zoom was like, oh man, this guy's talking too much. We're just going to shut something down. Okay. The next thing I want to show off is portrait retouching. Now, you may, shoot portraits, or maybe like pretty much all of us, we have pictures of family. And the idea behind a portrait is you're taking a picture of a person and you want that person to look good. You want to have like a favorable view of them, something that's flattering. Now, I'm going to show this rather disturbing image of me, which this is totally I was setting up some lights and just doing some experiments, but I realized that this allows me to show off some of the things that I want to highlight here. So when we're looking at portraits, like the first thing that we focus in on are people's eyes. And in this case, I'm going to zoom in, and if you have a large screen, I apologize for being so intense here. We want to highlight the eyes, and almost every picture of a person, the eyes can use just a little bit of work. Now, in order to do that in the past, and actually I say this, but this is a pretty good illumination of my eyes. But again, what you'd have to do in the past is, maybe make a circular selection around each of the eyes, and then maybe add some contrast or add some exposure. Well, what I can do here instead is I can go into Luminar's Face AI, and I can go into eyes. There are a whole bunch of different things. I can just say eye enhancer. And again, I'm gonna exaggerate this to make sure it goes over the video connection. But if we show a before and after, so you can see that there's a little bit more exposure, there's a little bit more contrast, so the eyes pop a little bit more. Now, I can also do something like dark circles removal. Everybody's got dark circles under their eyes. And this is going to do a little bit. I think it's probably not as much because of the glasses, but that helps things a little bit. I can do things like eye whitening. I can, make my eyebrows a little bit darker if I need to. If I was doing something that was more of a model shoot, maybe I would want to, increase the redness or the saturation of the lips. So again, going back to what we know about what machine language is looking for, it's able to do this because it looked at this image and said, oh, there's a face, and those are eyes, and that's a nose, and that's a mouth. And so I can just say, make the eyes look better. Now, this is also where I think engineers tend to be a little bit crazy. So let's say you have an image where the eyes are just really, really dark. Like you don't really get any of this color detail. You could go to this iris pop-up and I could say, I want brown eyes. Now these are not my brown eyes, but they are, sort of generic brown eyes. Or let's say, you're doing something more creative. You have a model, you want them to have green eyes to match their outfit or something. You can do that. Again, this is the software knowing where the eyes are and adding this. And then I think because someone lost a bet, they also added cat. Now, I don't need to make any of my subjects or family members look like cats, but it's there. So I guess, okay, why not? Or, owl, which that's just freaky. So I'm going to get away from that really quickly. All right. So that's eye stuff. The next thing about doing portraits is skin. Now, hopefully you can see again, because I'm zoomed way in, like the skin on my face here, the skin on my face, the skin in this photo is like I don't have fantastic model skin. And so one thing that I could do is do some skin smoothing. Now, the problem is, there's a long history of retouching and photoshopping where someone will, smooth the skin and the person just kind of looks like they've been turned into a Barbie doll, or, they're just plastic. So if I increase the skin AI slider, this amount slider, and there's even a shine removal, which gets rid of some of the glare there. Now I'll do a before and after. Whoop. So this is before, a little bit more texture, a little bit more modeling, and this is after. Now what I want to point out two things about this. One, it definitely makes me look a little more flattering. Like my skin just looks better, but importantly, it doesn't look like everything's just been blurred. Like you still have texture. If I zoom in even more, like there are still pores and wrinkles and all the things that make skin look like real skin. But even more important, I want to show off the beard area. And this is where a lot of software falls down because it knows where a face is, and so it just applies this blur to it. But Luminar in particular, I like because that still looks like hair. It still looks like facial hair. I did this once in Photoshop has a neural filter, and it it basically made it look like I had put like Vaseline on my beard because it was just all smushy. So here is again like it's taken me longer to do this because I'm explaining as I go, but I can make this, make people look better with just a few different sliders because the software knows what it's looking. It understands what it's looking at. And this would also apply, let's say you have a picture of 3 or 4 people. You could say, I want the skin for everybody to look better. And it would do that. It would set those out for each different person. Okay. I'm going to go back to my examples here. I'm going to go back to this fella. Another thing that the software can do, again, because it knows what's going on, is change the background blur. So in this case, again, this is one of my favorite buildings in Seattle. But to be honest, like it's kind of fighting for attention with the subject. And so if you're shooting with an iPhone, you could set it to portrait mode, and it does basically what I'm going to show here. Or if you're shooting with like a traditional camera with a lens with a nice wide aperture, you could get that natural depth of field. But I didn't do that in this case, so I'm just going to increase this portrait bokeh. I've never learned how to say it correctly. And so now we have a nice soft background. And you can see, like, there's a little bit of it. It's caught a little bit of a street lamp back there. And so you can go and you can edit the mask a little bit. But, if you did not see this beforehand, you probably wouldn't even think twice about, oh, that's an artificially blurred background. And that's pretty cool. Okay. I do have a couple more things that that I want to show just as examples of what one can do. And this is not something I'm going to show live because it's a lot more computationally intensive. But like one thing that we run into, especially when we're editing photos, is sometimes you need to either make something disappear, like maybe there's a piece of trash on the ground, or maybe you you have some like dust sensor spots in the sky, and there are healing tools that'll do that. The sort of king of being able to do this is Adobe Photoshop, which has content aware fill. And if you've ever used it, you basically just click something, and let's see if we can do this real quick. You drag over something, and it pretty intelligently just makes that thing disappear and blends it in with the background. All right, so that's super cool. But what about video? So I have an example here. Okay, so here's a video of some Yahoo in his backyard taking some drone video of his roof. And, it's fine, except Yahoo didn't quite realize that he's standing right in the shot. And maybe this is the only option that you have. Well, in Adobe After Effects, and granted this is a bit more complicated, and so here's just a screenshot of what this looks like. I can say I want to use content aware fill to get rid of that Yahoo, but this is video. And so what you can do is, here's the result. I've basically just gotten rid of myself, and it honestly looks like I was never there. And this is all because of machine language features. Yeah, I think, let's see, given our time, why don't we jump into questions? And if we have a little bit more time, I can probably show maybe 1 or 2 more things, but
all right,
want to make sure we get questions answered.
Okay, so we have about 3 or 4 minutes. If someone has a question for Jeff that pertains to what we've just looked at or anything in the presentation, I will let you raise your hand. Please do not unmute yourself and speak out. Jerry Billmeyer, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Jerry?
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. Very good, very good. And you basically covered on a little bit the that picture of the gentleman in front of the building in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you had taken that as you did. One time we talked about using the portrait and getting the boga to blur it. But could you have used the depth perspective? I don't know what they consider for it, and then gone into the depth layers and done some masking to accomplish your problem?
Yes, actually. So if I'd shot that using the portrait mode, what's really cool about portrait mode, what the iPhone camera is doing in real time is basically what I showed there in Luminar, which is it's detecting the subject and it's artificially blurring the background. Now, what's super great about portrait mode photos, you can open that in the Photos app, and when you edit it, you can control like how much blur is applied. So I think by default, it has a blur of like a simulated f4 aperture. And there's just a slider on the iPhone and on the Mac where you can just say, you know what, I want that background to be even more blurry. And so you can set that to like f1.8, and it will simulate even some of the like the bloom that happens with some lights. It's smart enough to do a really good simulation of what that is. If I then said, you know what, I really want more attention paid to that image, well, you can set the simulated aperture basically to I want to say f16, which is basically what the image was actually shot at. And it's just removing that simulated blur. And so you have a lot of flexibility just in the Photos app itself for controlling that background blur. So what I showed in Luminar is really good for a shot that you realize later on that you want to have that blur, but didn't get it originally.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Michael Slider, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. That was a good presentation. I had two questions regarding the video where you got rid of yourself.
Yeah.
What was the Adobe software that you used?
It was Adobe After Effects.
After
This
Effects.
this is like the high-powered thing that movie studios use for basically if you go to if you watch a movie or TV show that has any special effects, a lot of it was done in After Effects.
Oh, really? Okay. Does Adobe support Photoshop Express with video?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. They they have. That's a very good question. I'm not quite sure. I know that the Lightroom versions that were released yesterday, you can now edit video, but
I saw that. Right.
more accurately, you can edit video clips. You can make adjustments like exposure and color and such, and then you can also trim a clip. So you can't like put multiple clips together and edit a movie like you could in, say, Premiere Pro or Premiere Rush or Final Cut Pro, but it has some of that there.
And what about Apple's iMovie?
I don't think iMovie has that sort of replacement technology.
Okay.
So far as I know, After Effects is the only one that's doing it, but I'm sure there are others.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Michael. And with that, our presentation time has come to an end. And Jeff, I want to thank you for all of your questions and your great presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to George.